when I initially got started in stringing, um, and I started a tennis shop, I went to World Super Show. It's and it was in Atlanta. And that back then it's like that's where everybody goes for the sports information. And you could get certified in stringing and just learn about the industry. And since I was opening a shop, my partner and I, we went to Georgia, Atlanta, and spent the week at this trade show, and it was awesome. And I like trade shows anyways. In college, I studied marketing, and I just love trade shows and just being part of all that anyway. So I was like, all right. So we went to this, and, we got certified. I got my MRT there, my testing and all that kind of stuff. It helped our shop. You have some credibility for your retailers, like, oh yeah, he's got some certification or whatever. But outside of that, that was pretty much the value of it. It was valuable at that time. Is it really worth that? There's some years where I let it lapse, and recently I subscribed to it again, just, but so, that United States Racket Stringers Association, it's an association. It's not when I think of a trade organization, I think of one that looks out for the industry and to better the industry. And that's maybe, it doesn't necessarily have to be nonprofit, but a little bit more unbiased in order to really serve everybody equally. They all have some type of bias, or I always remember all the material that came from the USRSA always had, it was either gamma, it was alpha, and a few other brands, and that's maybe head. That's really all you ever heard about. You never heard about all the other 100 companies that did tennis stuff. And so I was wondering about that. So, we can kind of make some assumptions. I don't know for sure. I'm not part of any of those organizations, but I've been a member, and I've given them, my money. And the one thing that's kind of, their website, I don't know how often you go on their website, but the USR's website, I swear that hasn't changed in 25 years. 20 years.
Essentially, the look hasn't changed. But as to the connection to, for example, gamma, if I recall correctly, the founders of the USRSA were behind gamma, or very closely linked to gamma. There was something like that, So, these kind of links come out when you look a little closely.
And again, this is all for entertainment purposes. I'm not saying, this is how it is for sure. This is just how I know it, and this is how you know it. So, we're just talking about it, right? But and sometimes, I have I had somebody contact me, actually, UKRC.
Okay.
In contact. No, Richard, and so, it's good to get those updates, and we want to support all of the folks that, help the industry out just in general, right? But you got to really understand, because if you're a new person, and you're like, oh, this organization, this is going to be great, and you take in all their information, and that's all you have, you're going to have a 1 point perspective, and you're not going to have a little bit, more of a global look at what's going on, and is this really truth? All right, because you kind of got to learn how to do your own research and not take everything for face value. And that's what I think when you sent that email, it got me thinking a little bit, because your email was kind of saying, hey, all these organizations, this person owns this one, and this person owns this one, and so really, how unbiased are they, and where is their bias coming from? And so
I made a couple notes, so forgive me if my eyes stray a bit, but
no.
A professional association is usually nonprofit, and ultimately seeks to further profession, the interests of individuals and organizations engaged in that profession, and the public interest. And so this could be something as mundane as an association of chartered accountants, or a bar association, or anything. And then there's a guild, which is an association of artisans and merchants who oversee the practice of their craft or trade in a particular area. And, it's complicated, because, they mentioned the word public interest. And if it's something such as, even, you look at, being a barber, that's professionally regulated in most jurisdictions. You need a license from the jurisdiction in which you practice, or to be an attorney, and so on. But with racket stringing, I don't think most jurisdictions care or see a public interest
Yeah.
element in it, and that they need to protect the public from it. And um, so that's not going to be very high on any state's, kind of Department of Financial or Professional or whatever regulation getting into racket stringing. But that said, kind of, every organization or a company has its own kind of perspective. And so when you look at the companies in tennis, you've got, in terms of especially those that have some kind of a racket stringing team, you've got Babala, Head, Technifiber, Wilson, Yonex, and previously Gozen. And
And Solinko is starting
Lincoln,
to,
that's right.
yeah.
And so each one, may have slightly different ways of doing things. And
Mhm.
in terms of, the retail side, some manufacturers will say you must string a racket this way, otherwise the warranty is no good. Um, some will say string it, top down, string it bottom up, whatever you like, it doesn't matter. We engineer our rackets to be strung whichever way. And so when it comes down to the actual qualifications or the organizations, I mean, I kind of, you know, I took your list and I kind of compared with my notes and I kind of compiled them together. And, in terms of what's there today, there's the APRSA, the ERSA, the GRSA, the
Mhm.
JRSA, the UKRSA, the USRSA, and IART.
Right.
And there used to be a CRSA, as in China Racket Stringers Association, which I think was at least somewhat affiliated with the US RSA.
Mm.
There was the IRSA, the Italian Racket Stringers Association, which had some amount of cooperation with the UK RSA, but I don't think the IRSA is active anymore either. And
Mhm.
then there's that one that kind of, that MEF, which has some sort of association with the Italian Tennis Federation. It's
Mhm.
kind of one of two or three approved paths to become a tournament stringer in Italy. So there's a lot of alphabet soup um, with all the associations.
Yeah.
But in
And
terms of,
and a lot of them, like, what you're, also when you mentioned, the certification, some of these organizations do have that track, where, um, whether it's certification to be a certified stringer, or now the pro in Europe, a lot of those organizations they have a pro tour stringer kind of certification for all those stringers that want to be, tour stringers, because in the US there isn't anything related to that at all. Back when I started, when I strung with Wilson, the Wilson stringing team, they had their own certification. You would go, you could do it without actually stringing at a tournament too. You could go to New York for 5 days, I think it was 3 or 5 days, and you work with, a couple of the, whether it's RPNY or through that, and they would take you through this rigorous training for 3 days, and if you passed it, then could get on the list to be a stringer or whatever. And I know the first tournament that I strung at, I had to do that as well, but I did it at the US Open, kind of ingrained it in with stringing at the Open. And so I guess if I wouldn't have passed it, I would have gone home. but but yeah, it was kind of, yeah, it was kind of intense, a little bit, because you're just like, weren't really in your element stuff, but it was good. It kind of like stretched you a little bit. And so you got to have something like that. So yeah, the US, we don't really have anything that's for anybody, to do. But I know, the ERSA specifically has some programs like that. And I don't know, do you have any? And that's the one that you also
yeah.
went through. So tell me about that. Well, actually, we'll continue. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you there. We'll continue your train of thought, and then we'll
Sure.
continue on that. So.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, kind of with these associations, um, the ERSA was the first to introduce a high level kind of qualification in 2005, if I recall correctly, with the Pro Tour Stringer certification. The US RSA had done, of course, the certified stringer, then the CRT, which became the MRT, I believe.
Yep.
And
Yep.
but as you know, I mean, it's not a terribly challenging certification, the MRT. It's sort of same as with many of the professional licensure kind of standards and laws. If you're a licensed barber or a licensed physician or a licensed plumber or whatever it may be, it doesn't mean that you've got the stamp of approval of the state that you're a fantastic, plumber or barber or physician. It just
You're
means
just
that
competent. You're just competent,
yes,
and they assume that you can, like in this case, string a racket without breaking it.
yeah,
String a racket so the tension kind of comes out to how it's supposed to.
mhm,
You can put a grip on. You can
yep,
customize a grip. You can put a grommet strip on. And
yeah,
that's really what it's basically what the
mhm,
MRD, and that about the basic manufacturer's technology,
right,
because that's kind of the test that they give you every year. They just send you something and you just go through a sequence of, okay, this is the technology Yonex has, this is the technology Head has, and then you answer, questions, and then you send that back. And so it's just to
right,
get an update, so that way
mhm.
you're at least up to speed at the technologies that the companies have.
And I think the names of the certifications can be a source of confusion themselves because there's of course certified stringer, which doesn't leave too much up to the imagination. I think that's pretty clear.
Mhm.
But then master racket technician. The only difference between certified stringer and master racket technician is the written exam. So what suddenly makes somebody just from certified, as in something quite elementary, to a master?
Mhm.
Does it merit the change of name? I don't know. And even um, Pro Tour Stringer is, I think, a fair name. It's level 1 is stringing 3 by 19 rackets within 1 hour around the world, and one
Wow,
racket
within 1 hour, 3
within
rackets
1
within
hour.
1 hour. Okay.
Yep.
So
Um,
that right there in itself is a very good marker to kind of show if you can string at that level, because like with the MRT, it's really just, I think you have 2 hour. It's been a while since I've taken that test, obviously, because I've had it for dozen or 96, I think, yeah, a long time.
yeah.
So but like, I think it was, you have to string 2 rackets in 2 hours or something like that,
One within 1 hour,
or one, yeah. So that you
and
can
that's
do with
it's
not too
hybrid.
much effort. But if you're stringing 3 of the same
Mhm.
in 1 hour, that definitely would show stamina, and also you can't really mess up a lot.
And there's the consistency element too, because the string bed stiffness is measured, and they've got to be
Oh
within
yeah,
one
okay.
point of each other on the
Yeah,
ERT.
yeah.
And then you've got to string one racket with natural gut, same thing.
Oh, okay.
And then
Yeah, so
match two
yeah, so
rackets. Yeah. And then
it
there's
really
a
tests you.
customization element too. You've got to match 2 rackets to within 1 millimeter on the balance, 1 gram on the mass, and 1 point on the swing weight. And then the level 2, same thing, but 18 by 20 instead of 16 by 19.
Mhm.
Um, so those were good, again, like 17 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah.
There hasn't been much in the way of evolution with certification since then, but the ERSA renamed its certifications other than the Pro Tour Stringer after kind of the cooperation agreement with the USRC changed somehow. And so now what they used to call MRT, I think they call Master Professional Stringer. Um, and there's some other things, but again, the names themselves, if I were kind of coming in having no idea and I saw somebody saying Master Professional Stringer versus this, and I'd think I'd kind of wonder what is the level and which one's higher, which one's lower. And even the Pro Tour Stringer, if somebody doesn't know that level 2 is higher and just sees level 2 versus level 1, somebody could think level 2 is lower, level 1's the higher one.
Yeah. And I don't know how it is in Europe, but I mean, I know, like in the United States, if you try to move from just being a stringer to being a tour stringer, if you tell them, hey, yeah, I'm an MRT and I've strung at a shop, that isn't going to get you anywhere.
No.
You have to have the connections, and they really need to see that you can string at a higher level. So that MRT is not going to help you become a tour stringer at all.
No.
Okay, so but as far as the ERSA level 1 or level 2 tour stringer, that might get you farther, right? Because it get
Sometimes.
at least it gets you through, kind of like if you think of a job, right? HR knows nothing about
Mhm.
your job role, but they have to at least screen you
Right.
and make sure you have these minimum qualifications. And maybe if you have that Pro Tour certification, that at least gets you in the door to at least talk to the people who know how to string and to go, okay, he's at least got this.
Mhm. It can, and it certainly did for quite a long time. And what I mean is, enough tournaments, especially this kind of coincides with when you look around 2008, the end of the first decade of the 2000s, um, freedom of movement of people within Europe began. And so, where teams such as the Wimbledon team used to have stringers from Japan, from the US, from all over the world, it suddenly became essentially closed off to anybody who came from outside of Europe.
Yeah, like
And
I could never string there because they don't accept anybody outside of the EU, I think, right?
yeah, that
Yeah,
was
I
the
think so.
case, exactly. I mean, they said it would be extremely difficult, that they'd have to have lawyers sort it out. And so it became closed off to anybody who came from outside of the EU. And kind of along with that, they really pushed the Pro Tour stringer credentials. So it became a team of essentially EU Pro Tour stringers. And even since Brexit is now fully in effect, um, when they could theoretically bring in non-EU stringers, that hasn't changed. Will it? I don't know. Should it? Yes. Um,
And there's also a small, I mean, it's really, I guess the Pro Tour stringer circuit is pretty tight in the
mhm.
sense that there's a certain number of stringers that are the core group that do a lot of the work.
Yeah.
It's they're not obviously going to do all the tournaments, but it's like there's a core group, and those core groups I think are usually established at the larger tournaments, like let's say the Grand Slams or the top 16, right?
Mhm.
And then some of those stringers will go out to some of the auxiliary, some of the smaller tournaments
Yeah.
as they happen.
Mhm.
And so it kind of filters out. And then at some of those tournaments, when they need some backup stringers or somebody can't be at that tournament, or that's where really new people can come in.
Mhm.
But usually those core groups are set up, and it's harder to get into the core groups unless I mean, you just have to be in the right place at the right time. But there's just a small group. I mean, this isn't a large. You run into the same people at the same tournaments, that kind of thing. At least from my experience.
Yeah, I think you're basically right. The same kind of general group, whether especially at the level of the majors and the masters, and it trickles down a bit to the 500 levels. Um, but yeah, essentially, if you look at the teams that still have a very international uh, makeup and not just Eurocentric, the Wilson team certainly has stringers from all over the world. The head team, it's the same situation. The Babola team, the Yonex team, um, and the Technifiber team, because now they do Miami, um, and so
And things change so often. It's like at the pro level, whoever can. Yeah, I mean, it's a whole political thing, too,
Mhm.
getting at those tournaments. And sometimes, you know what? It's exposure. Those companies want exposure because it's not really,
Right.
many times it's not really a big moneymaker
Mm-mm.
for the companies. It's exposure that they're paying for.
Mhm.
They're losing. It's not, yeah. So I won't really get into that too much, but
But yeah, I mean, basically and let's see, through this year, I mean, now Babola is taking over the Wimbledon stringing concession. For the last decade plus, roughly, after Bobrand gave up the stringing, it went to Apollo Leisure, and now it's kind of been Apollo Leisure powered by Babola for quite a number of years, and now it's going fully as Babala, no longer Apollo Leisure starting next year.
It's fun to talk, it's fun to talk tennis, and it's fun to, chat with you and stuff. You obviously have a lot of knowledge about what's going on outside of the US with some of this, because you've been involved in the ERSA for so long, and just been part of that. So as far as the associations, I mean, what else do you want to say before you really put your hard-earned money down on these? Figure out what it is that you want to get out of it. I mean, what is it you're looking for, right? Because they can all help you with getting the basics down, getting, they send you a book that has the basic patterns of all the rackets, and some of the connections, gives you maybe 10% off, for some of the companies when you're buying string and equipment and stuff, and kind of is a good way to get started in just racket stringing in general.
I think they all generally have a good goal, and that's sort of to train people to certify. But I think it's quite difficult these days to kind of see where things are going, because first of all, there are so many associations and conflicting priorities, or so on, and things can get political, unfortunately, in terms of brand loyalties and so on. As well, there's a big difference between now versus 45, 50 years ago. Back then, it wasn't that easy to find people to string a racket, and relatively few, I think, at clubs and so on. And now you'll always find someone who'll do it cheaper, not really better, likely. And the kind of what someone can expect to earn for stringing a racket is the same nominally as it was 45, 50 years ago, has not remotely kept pace with inflation, while everything else has gone up in terms of cost. And so that's something else that is kind of, I think, the profession struggles with, the fact that it's not given the level of respect I think it could deserve, because people don't see it as they would see what we were kind of talking about, the other professions. They see, attorney, accountant, plumber, barber, etc., as actual skilled trades. A racket stringer, I think they just look at as anybody who'll do it for the lowest price. And we're talking about at the highest levels as well. And so I think there needs to be some more legitimacy brought to the profession. I think there needs to be better cooperation among the various parties, whether the associations, the brands, and even though there's the Tennis Industry Association, for example, which kind of cooperates with the USRSA, there's not a lot of cooperation otherwise. And I think it's a shame, because I think they could do a lot better. There will always be conflicting views on how a racket should be strung. There's Gozen with its Haribito program, which is a sort of more or less bottom up way of stringing. And the others with maybe smaller differences. I think all that matters is that someone know the comprehensive ways of stringing and everything that comes along with it, and kind of be able to set aside his own ego when it comes to stringing for someone else, whether at a tournament or something else. And when all this might get hashed out, I don't know. I'm not holding my breath expecting it to happen. And it would be nice to see a greater level of cooperation, basically, among the brands. I mean, if the brands could cooperate among themselves and come up with some kind of an organization that could be a legitimate kind of non-profit association by its members, for its members, with a governing board, with a salaried, maybe even just whatever level of staff they need. And the reason I mention all this is because, again, it's kind of, where is the continuity?
You could bring the standard up.
Yes. Yep.
And also promote that standard on a professional level, because every once in a while you get a professional player that might say something about a stringer, or they do every year at at some Grand Slam, they always do the general. They'll walk through the stringing room and they'll do an interview, and but the people that do the interviewing know nothing about tennis.
Right.
They know, because beforehand they're like, okay, so what is it you're doing? What exactly? They know absolutely nothing about tennis. And then they're trying to ask some of these real basic questions. They don't really get into it. You need to have somebody interviewing somebody in a stringing room that knows something about tennis, and have that being broadcast at, and have it on all the Grand Slam sites, and have it, you need to, somebody needs to really advocate for that a little bit more. And I think, if, like what you're saying, if there's a bigger governing board that's connected more with the industry in general, I think you could go a lot farther, and it could bring it up the standard where it gets to the point where, yeah, nobody's going to be stringing a racket for $10, dude. No, it's not going to happen. It's going to be, yes.
Yeah, and as well, I think all the brands would have something to benefit, because every brand that has a stringing team, if they kind of make this joint effort, it means that they all have a pool of stringers to choose from, and not just stringers for one brand or the other. I guess, and unfortunately, like you said about the press, the pundits are also guilty of that. I mean, some of the we're talking former professional players who will say something about stringing on air without, it could be completely misinformation, and people will believe it because, oh, so and so played professional tennis at a very high level once upon a time. But
Matthew, it's been nice having you on. We're going to definitely have a part 2 on this.